Okay, let's make sure this is actually streaming, since I once streamed to nobody for 40 minutes. All right, here we go. All right, so today I'm humbled and honored to be here with Ian Clarke. He is the founder and one of the lead developers of the Freenet project. Freenet is an open source networking project that seeks to create a decentralized, uncensorable internet that is free for anybody to use, and it's done a really good job of doing that. He received a FUTO Legendary Grant recently. FUTO Legendary Grants are grants given out to people and projects that have done excellent work in the world of returning freedom of their technology back to the user where it belongs, whether it is a platform, a piece of hardware, or a piece of software. It's our way of saying thank you with no strings attached, and there are links down below as well as a questionnaire and an email process for anybody interested in these grants. So thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
So can you just introduce yourself a little bit? Give us a brief overview.
Yeah, sure. My name is Ian Clarke. I have a degree in computer science and artificial intelligence, and I'm probably best known as the creator of Freenet, which started out as a undergrad project that I did while studying computer science and AI at the University of Edinburgh, and yeah, since doing that, that's kind of been an ongoing project ever since. But I've done a bunch of other stuff, everything from machine learning, online advertising. I think most of my career I've spent as a software architect, designing software on large scale, building and running engineering teams, that type of stuff.
So this is a quote. Freenet attempts to remove the possibility of any group imposing its beliefs or values on any data. What may be acceptable to one group of people may be considered offensive or even dangerous to another. In essence, the purpose of Freenet is to ensure that no one is allowed to decide what is acceptable. This is not a quote from a year or two ago. This is a quote from over 20 years ago. So you seem to have been about 20 years ahead of your time.
Story of my life.
Because I remember trying out Freenet in 2003 when I was 14 years old, just thinking, oh, this is a cool project. Why is censorship an issue? Like, I don't see censorship as an issue on the internet at all. Mm-hmm. And you saw it as an issue in the late 90s, enough to act on it.
Yeah, I mean, it really started while I got to university, which was really my first exposure to the internet. And around about that time, people would kind of say things like the internet roots around censorship. And there was this real perception of the internet as this decentralized, anarchic place. But as I was learning about how the internet worked, I realized that it was actually the opposite, that this was potentially the most easily controlled, censored, monitored technology that had yet been created. It's very difficult to kind of open everyone's snail mail, but it's very easy to read everyone's email when you control the infrastructure. And so I started to think about how would you build a layer on top of the internet that would allow people to communicate without fear of censorship, whether it's by government or powerful organizations. And then at the same time, just technically, I was very interested in this area called emergent systems. And emergent systems, you see them throughout nature. So an emergent system is any time where you have a large number of individual simple components. And when you put them all together and let them interact, they exhibit sophisticated behavior on a large scale. So the classic example would be an ant colony. Ants are really dumb. They've got like 900 neurons. They follow very simple rules. Yet you put a few thousand of them together, and they can build a colony, defend it, feed themselves, reproduce, etc., etc. And so I was very, very interested in that technically. And at that time, and really since, nobody had ever designed a system that relied on this kind of emergent architecture type approach. And I eventually realized that if somebody were to build a decentralized internet that was not subject to this kind of control, emergent architectures have all of the properties that you would want such a system to have. They tend to be decentralized. They tend to be highly survivable. So if you've ever had a problem with ants, you can stamp on the ants all day. The ant colony is not going to collapse. And so I set about designing an architecture based on these principles that would allow people to publish and consume information without having to worry about people looking over their shoulder.
That is cool. So you've said that members of the Tech Oligopoly have censored accurate information. And one of the people I subscribe to on YouTube, Eli the Computer Guy, has over 1 million subscribers. And he had said in a video a year ago that his wife and him got the vaccine because of a concern about his wife who had had 3 cancers. And his video was taken down for talking negatively about this vaccine, even though the statement he said was not only harmless, but also factual if you ask any doctor. As the creator of an uncensorable anonymous network, can you expound on your thoughts on internet censorship in a world where about 3 to 4 companies control who has the right and ability to say certain things?
Well, I think the pandemic has really illustrated this problem maybe better than anything else. Probably the example that most easily springs to mind for me is the lab leak theory, the theory that that the COVID-19 began in a lab in Wuhan, and that information was censored online. The experts early in the pandemic all came out and said, no, it's definitely not a lab leak. Of course, we now know that they were all kind of conflicted because a lot of them had relationships with the lab in Wuhan. And I think it's now pretty much consensus, not definite that it was a lab leak, but that it was more likely than not that it was a lab leak. So there was that and many other examples. And I think one of the things that has changed over the last 20 years is 20 years ago, the concern was really government censorship. We were thinking about the Chinese government, the government in Iran, and other countries around the world where the internet is censored. But what we've learned, particularly over the past 5 to 10 years, is that when the public square is privately owned, which is essentially the situation we're in with the internet, a handful of companies control the infrastructure, then it doesn't really take government censorship. Censorship can happen because of a private company, and they can not only remove your voice, they can remove your bank account, they can make it pretty much impossible to function in the modern world if they don't like what you're saying. And I view that as really a threat to democracy.
And you viewed it as that 15 to 20 years before it actually was one, which is really ahead of its time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like one of the issues that I see here is it's not even about when you say something wrong. It's when you say something right, but some stupid algorithm or somebody who barely understands English, whose job 18 hours a day is to go through all these complaints and just randomly decide whether or not the AI farting did something correct or wrong, has the ability to take down something that you worked for 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the kind of automated stuff, but the question I ask people when they defend that kind of censorship, which a lot of people do, is who do you trust to be the censor? Do you trust Mark Zuckerberg to have that level of control? Do you trust this political administration or maybe the next political administration, which might be the other party? Who do you trust?
Yeah, I try to explain it as if you've been to if you've tried to file an insurance claim and you call up your insurance provider and they say, oh, this particular appointment is not covered under your insurance plan, or do you want to trust that type of person, like the type of person who is just sitting there 18 hours a day, eyes glazed over, just going through all this stuff with some of the most important things in your life?
Absolutely.
And your ability to communicate, your ability to share, your ability to do business, and I would say no.
Mm-hmm.
So you've said you cannot guarantee freedom of speech and enforce copyright law. Powerful words. Now, our founder here has said that selfish content creators can't tolerate losing control over the distribution of their work. If they want to be uncancelable, at some extent, you have to relinquish this control, your ability to say exactly who can get their content. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about the fact that you can't guarantee freedom of speech and enforce copyright law?
Yeah, I mean, this was really much more of an issue 20 years ago than today. Back when Freenet first kind of started getting a lot of public attention, it was in the context of Napster and people sharing predominantly copyrighted music online. And the perception was that whereas Napster was centralized and therefore could be shut down, and of course was shut down for that reason, the perception was that Freenet was decentralized and couldn't be shut down, which was true. The difference was that with Freenet, we really weren't thinking about how to help people kind of get the latest Britney Spears album for free. We were thinking much more about political speech and that type of stuff. But it's simply the case with copyright that in order to enforce copyright, you have to be able to limit who can share what information with other people. And my philosophy with freedom of speech, in a nutshell, or freedom of communication, is that if two people wish to exchange information, and it's a kind of consenting relationship, then they should be free to do so without the interference of any third party, whether it's their government or whether it's their email provider or anything else. So with copyright, you need to be able to control how people share information. So there's a fundamental incompatibility between a absolutist perspective on freedom of communication like I have and enforcing copyright law.
Yeah, there's one interesting line in your website, and again, this is just ahead of its time. Alternatives to copyright, and you talk about the simplest is voluntary payment and a patronage system. We actually practice what we preach in this regard. On March 15, 2001, the Freenet project started taking donations, and in a week, you got $1,000. And this is like almost 20 years before sites like Patreon or Patreon or Streamlabs for donations and any of this stuff existed. And there was this one kid I remember on Twitch. He had like a little Casio keyboard, and he would just play stuff. And after 8 minutes of playing music, he had $217 in donations. And he was just working out of his room. He looked like he was a 16 or 17-year-old kid. And that model actually does work. There are a lot of people that are more than happy to say, I'm not interested in this album that costs $3 million to produce. I'm not paying $15 for that. But this is a cool performance. I'll give this kid $20 for playing.
Yeah, we did a lot of thinking back then, because when you tell people you can't enforce copyright, it prompts the question, well, how do you reward creativity without copyright? And we actually, we came up with an idea which we called fair share back then, which was really akin to, quite similar to what Patreon later became. And in that it was kind of voluntary donations. And people at that time were like, there's no way voluntary donations will be kind of sufficient to reward people in the way that copyright is. But of course, we've learned since that, you can raise millions of dollars on Kickstarter just through voluntary donations, simply because people want something to exist.
Yeah. So the original Freenet paper is one of the most cited papers I've seen in computer science over the past 2 decades. So there's a lot of academics that understand it deeply. But for those who are not like deeply involved in computer science, can you just kind of briefly describe what the original Freenet was? And you've described your inspiration for creating it, but tell us a little bit about what the original Freenet project was.
Yeah, so the original software and really the new software is it's some software that you download to your computer, you run it on your computer, and it creates a layer on top of the internet that, in the case of the original Freenet, is kind of like a shared hard disk, in that anyone can publish to this shared hard disk, and anyone else can access information on this shared hard disk. And it's all kind of secured through cryptography. But yeah, to using the original Freenet, you use it through your web browser. So you can visit a website, or we call them free sites, in your web browser. It's a lot slower than the internet. It's faster today, but it's still relatively slow. But you can consume information that way, and you can also build other things like email-like services on top of it. But the original Freenet was, pretty slow, and again, kind of like a hard disk. And one of the things that the big differences with Liquidus, which is the new project, is that it's much more akin to an entire computer. You can actually do computation in a decentralized way, and you can build quite complex decentralized software on top of this platform. So it kind of takes the original Freenet concept, firstly makes it a lot faster to use, makes it a lot more flexible, makes it a lot easier to use. The original Freenet software I kind of describe as hobbyist grade software. It was very much a kind of experimental. And despite that, we probably had 7 million downloads of the software over the past 20 years. But really with Liquidus, the idea is to create something that's, quote, consumer grade, something that's very easy to install, easy to use, and is really able to provide a replacement for most of the services that people use the internet for today, except completely decentralized, where you're not beholden to any third party.
So Freenet was open source, uncensorable, anonymous, and decentralized. Liquidus is your new project, and that seems to be focused for more where the internet is in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you came out with this in the year 2000, you didn't have YouTube. I mean, the best that you had is every now and then you'd have ads that played in Real Player.
Mm-hmm.
There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. You had, you know, PHP, BB forums, and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
So what is Liquidus going to do that's different from original Freenet? Because Freenet had a lot of stuff that was ahead of its time, like, you know, distributed hash tables, cryptographic contracts, a lot of this stuff, you know, that people talk about when they talk about decentralization and blockchain now. This was radical like 22 years ago. But what is Liquidus doing differently than Freenet?
It's really, I think the point about being a full computer versus just the hard disk kind of gets to the core of it. So you can, peers in Liquidus can kind of run software on behalf of each other in a way that's safe. We use WebAssembly, which is kind of a modern replacement for JavaScript, to do this. But from the user's perspective, the idea is that you could build an email-like system on top of it. You could build an instant messaging-like system on top of it. You could build a Twitter-like system on top of it. All of these are kind of, or most of those require real-time communication, which is something Liquidus is capable of that the original Freenet was not.
So what makes Liquidus capable of that type of real-time communication in a way that Freenet doesn't while remaining decentralized? Because while the original Freenet project is cool, I remember in 2003, like having what was considered fast back then, 768 kilobyte per second DSL, but loading like a 30 kilobyte website would take, you know, upwards of 10 minutes, which is, you know, something that wouldn't work for something like a modern Twitter or Facebook that would be run on top of it. So how does Liquidus solve that problem while remaining decentralized?
Yeah, so the core idea behind Liquidus, and this is really the same core idea behind Freenet, is something called a small world network. So you may be familiar with the notion of 6 degrees of separation. The idea of small world networks originated in the 1960s. A social scientist called Stanley Milgram did an experiment, actually did many experiments, one of which was the Stanford prison experiment, which is probably his best known experiment, but that's a digression. But yeah, so Stanley Milgram did this experiment where he went to a bunch of people in Kansas and kind of the middle of the country, and he gave them all letters with the names of somebody in Boston, Massachusetts that they didn't know. And he told them, you got to get this letter to this person, but you can only get it to them by sending it to somebody that you know personally. And they can only get it by sending it to someone they know personally. And so he ran this experiment with hundreds of letters, and of the letters that arrived, he discovered that the median number of people they went through in order to get to their destination was 6. So this is pretty incredible. In a country of almost 300 million people at the time, you could get from one person to any other person in just 6 steps.
That's crazy.
Just by going through kind of personal relationships, people that they know personally. And this was an entirely decentralized process, of course, because it's just depending on what the people that each individual knows. And that's really the core principle behind Freenet and Liquidus. So peers in the Liquidus network self-organize into a small world network. It turns out that if you just kind of randomly connect people together, you're not going to get a small world network. The network has to have this particular property where 2 peers in the network that are close together need to be much more likely to be connected than 2 peers which are far apart.
So this small world network is what would make Liquidus different from Freenet in terms of snappiness and the ability to run.
Not exactly. They both rely on the small world network. In terms of speed, the key idea with Liquidus is that with Freenet, you push data into it, and then at some point in the future, somebody retrieves that data. With Liquidus, you push data into it, and other people can subscribe to that data. And so when it changes, when it's updated, they are notified instantly of the update, or like where instantly is hopefully less than a second. So that's kind of, it's called an observable key value store, and the observable refers to the fact that you can watch some data in Liquidus and be notified immediately when it changes.
Now, being something that's decentralized and also uncensorable, would you deal with potential masses of spam on this? Like, is this an append-only data structure, or how would you deal with that?
So it's not an append-only data structure. Data in Liquidus is mutable. So you can push data into it, and then you can update it. And the criteria for how you update the data is specified using a cryptographic contract, which I can speak a little bit more about how that works. But in terms of preventing spam, you can build systems on top of Liquidus. And so one of the systems that we've designed, we call them anti-flood tokens. And so this is where you create a token generator, which you can do in a variety of ways. The easiest, probably the simplest way is you make a donation to Freenet, and then we'll allocate a token generator to you, and we'll provide other more decentralized mechanisms in the future. But then once you have a token generator, it'll generate tokens at some fixed rate. So it might be once every 5 minutes, it might be once an hour, it might be once a day. And if you want to, let's say we were using an email-like system on top of Liquidus, and I wanted to send you an email, you might say, hey, if you want to send me an email, you got to spend a 5-minute token, which means I have to take one of my tokens that are generated every 5 minutes and spend it in order to get my email into your inbox. Now, if you find you're getting too much spam, you can raise the threshold. You can say, I want a 30-minute token or a 2-hour token, which is effectively raising the bar for what it takes to get into your inbox. And so this is a simple mechanism that relies on cryptography that can create a cost for sending messages or doing other things that might cause spam. Then we're also building a more sophisticated system, which is a web of trust-based reputation system, such that you might say, well, if you want to send me a message, you got to put some reputation on the line. And then if I send you a message and it turns out it's spam, or you don't like it for any other reason, you can give me feedback which will be visible to anyone else who is aware of my reputation. So there are these kind of systems that you can build on top of Liquidus that can address problems like spam.
What is the difference fundamentally between something like Tor and Freenet?
I think there are a variety of differences. Probably the main one is that Tor, there's a Tor network, which are Tor relays, which I think there are maybe 4,000, there might be more now. But these relays have a privileged status within the Tor network. And if you're just using Tor as a user, you're not running one of these relays. So you're not really contributing back to the network. With Liquidus, if you're using Liquidus, you're contributing back to the network to the extent that you can. Obviously, if you're running Liquidus on a cell phone, you probably don't want it using vast amounts of data eating up your battery. But to the extent you're willing to contribute back to the network, you can do so. And so I would describe Liquidus is more of a kind of true peer-to-peer, in that participants in the network also form part of the network, and that's different to Tor. I think core goal of Tor is to provide anonymity, like that's really the point. The core goal of Liquidus is to be decentralized. You can build anonymity services on top of Liquidus, but Liquidus anonymity is not kind of baked into the Liquidus operating system itself. Rather, it's a service that can be built on top of Liquidus.
So you've mentioned frustration with the fact that reputation systems now are behind walled gardens. And by reputation systems, we mean eBay feedback, Yelp reviews, Google reviews, Uber reviews. And you had mentioned Yelp and Uber in your presentation. And that got me thinking, you know, I could have an amazing reputation on Yelp as a repair shop owner and a garbage reputation on Uber as a driver, for anybody who's probably watched my driving streams can attest to. So can you talk about the reputation system in Liquidus and how this would work? If you have a decentralized reputation system, how would you deal with people having different verticals for their reputation to be judged?
Yeah, so fundamentally, I mean, this is, in a way, Liquidus is my kind of answer to all of the ways that I think the internet has kind of gone wrong over the past 20 years in its architecture. And one of the things that I think kind of went wrong was the internet went down this client-server path where you've got a web server sitting in a kind of air-conditioned data center on a fast connection, and then you have clients which really just kind of consume information from the server. And one of the effects of that approach is that people who are building services on the internet really kind of have a disincentive to make those services talk to each other a lot of the time. There was a time like about maybe kind of late 2000s, like 2007-ish, where it became very fashionable to build APIs for your service. So Twitter had an API, Facebook had an API, Reddit had an API. And the idea was these things should be components that can interact with each other. But of course, what they discovered was that the way people would use the APIs would sometimes cause spam, or they would sometimes undermine the business model of the services. And so most of them shut down their APIs. The Twitter API is a lot less functionality than it used to have. Facebook kind of more or less shut down their API. Reddit, I think, more or less kept theirs. But the way it should work, and I would kind of describe this as the Unix philosophy, is you really want to build software in such a way that you have simple interoperable components. And that's what kind of accelerates innovation. And that's really, so what I want to do with Liquidus is you can build interoperable components like a reputation system that multiple different services can be built upon, so that we don't get the current kind of walled garden situation. So with Liquidus, the way we handle reputation is a mechanism called web of trust. And this is not a new idea. It's something that has existed with email since the early 90s, and we used it with the original Freenet as well. But the notion of web of trust is that you can establish trust relationships with people that are transitive. So if I trust you and you trust somebody else, then I would, to some degree, trust the person that you trust. And so it kind of creates this web of trust that allows people to establish reputations. And the reputation, of course, can be for different stuff. I might have a good reputation as a software engineer, but not a good reputation as a gardener. And so reputation is contextual as well, and this system can accommodate that.
The difficult questions. If you have a network that is uncensorable, decentralized, anonymous, and open source, how do you prevent the detestable content from getting out there, the CSAM, the bombings, the plannings of all sorts of horrible things, and also why are you not in jail? I remember one of the most upvoted comments on this thread discussing the new network was, I had a bet with a friend in 2004. He said in 10 years you would be dead or in prison, and I'm still waiting to collect on my bet because
he keeps waiting.
No, he was on the winning side of that one. So I mean, do people knock on your door and from everything that shows in the Freenet paper, it really doesn't seem like you have there's no back door in this. There's no way to locate any of it.
And that's really the protection. So one of the things that I say a lot, and it's true both of the original Freenet and of Liquidus, is that if somebody put a gun to my head and say, hey, we want the keys, we want to, be able to shut down Liquidus or remove people's anonymity, I could not do it.
It's a great way to avoid getting a gun to your head.
Exactly.
Building it right the first time.
Exactly. And so we kind of protect ourselves through the design by making it pretty much impossible for us to compromise the network or so there is no backdoor by design, and that's part of what protects us. We've never had any negative interaction with law enforcement. In fact, the interactions we have had with the U.S. government have been positive. So we talked to what was then called the International Broadcasting Bureau, who do Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and that type of thing. They were very excited about Freenet because they thought it could be used in countries like China and Saudi Arabia to circumvent government censorship. So that hasn't been a problem in practice, fortunately.
I mean, morally or ethically, like when you go to sleep at night, there's so many people that have probably benefited from being able to learn about the world that couldn't through this amazing technology. But does ever a part of you think, like, crap, there's somebody out there doing something screwed up on a network that I created? Or is it like, does the good outweigh the bad?
I think it's a case of the good outweighing the bad. I think when you think about the stakes, like for me, the stakes are really democracy. Like you cannot... the basic idea behind democracy is that the electorate chooses their own government. In order to make that choice effectively, the electorate needs to know what's going on. If the government can limit how they can communicate with each other, then they won't necessarily know what's going on or have an accurate view of it, and so they can't fulfill their role as voters. And so I see it as essential for democracy. And democracy is what protects us against everything else. If you don't have democracy, you don't have rule of law, you're essentially the powerless are subject to the whims of the powerful. And so that's the positive, which I view as a very, very big positive. On the negative side, of course, any tool, there are things people can do with that tool that are going to be bad.
Yeah, I remember logging into it before you came to do your presentation here at FUTO for the grant. And one of the things that I was expecting to see all this horrible stuff. And when I logged in, one of the second pages I clicked on was actually a rehabilitation page for people that had otherwise in the past viewed CSAM-related content and things like that. And yeah, they even if they're saying, I want to get better, I do not want to do this anymore, this is not who I want to be, I want to resist this shit, they do not feel comfortable doing that on anything other than a completely decentralized, anonymized section of the internet. And it was like, it honestly put a small smile on my face to see that, well, what would be assumed to be this horrible platform, the second link that I clicked on was actually them trying to use it for something good.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, who's going to sign up for a website on that topic without the protection of anonymity? That's absolutely true. Now, there is an issue that you don't want somebody to fire up Freenet or fire up Liquidus and be inadvertently exposed to something that they don't want to see. But for us, that's what the reputation system's job is. So the reputation system, as we're designing it, will also form part of a search engine. So with Google, for example, the search results are ordered by Google's kind of secret sauce algorithm that SEO type people seem to get better every day at figuring out how to circumvent. With this system, we use a reputation system in order to assess the quality of search results. And so that's part of how we make sure that you're not going to be kind of innocently using Liquidus and suddenly get exposed to some content that you're not going to like.
It's funny because as good as people claim Google search algorithms are, and they do a lot of good things right, that I can't find one of my own websites on DuckDuckGo, for instance. There was this one guy that just changed the name of his business to MacBook Repair New York City because he couldn't outrank me. And after he changed his business name to MacBook Repair NYC, he was literally outranked me within a day. It's like you made your business name the search term, and you won. So if content is decentralized in nature, how does this affect longevity? Because there's some other blockchain kind of systems that have tried to distribute things like video, and one of the issues that I've seen some of these platforms have is they will have a CDN that is essentially propping up the network where 99% of the traffic is not being served by the peer-to-peer part. It's being served by the CDN because the users are being somewhat selfish and not choosing to share content. So, is this being run without large nodes? Does this seem realistic?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So one of the non-goals of Liquidus is being for long-term storage of data. So this would distinguish it from something like IPFS, for example, which is another kind of peer-to-peer decentralized storage system. But IPFS's explicit goal is to be for long-term storage of data, so kind of like a decentralized Dropbox. With Liquidus, it's not about long-term storage of data. It's about kind of publishing data to people who want to consume it. If you want your data to stay on Liquidus for a long period of time, it's up to you as the publisher to maintain it. And there's a mechanism where you can kind of ensure that the data stays in the network. If you're not doing that, the approach Liquidus takes, it's what's called the least recently used cache, which is the more people that are accessing the data, the more widely distributed it will be in the network. If absolutely nobody is interested in it, then eventually it will fall out of the network, unless the publisher of the data is kind of keeping it in the network.
How is the reputation system not a form of censorship in and of itself?
Well, because it's done entirely on behalf of the users participating in it. So the way I would define censorship is where you have two people, they want to share information, and some third party is preventing them from doing that. With the Liquidus reputation system, it's entirely empowering the individual. So you're deciding to use the reputation system. You're deciding who you're going to trust, and so it's really entirely driven by the individual user.
So it's adjustable. It's like you having the choice to choose a channel on your television versus somebody else saying this channel is not available to you.
Exactly. Like the analogy might be the safe search functionality in Google. It's entirely at the user's option, and so I wouldn't consider it censorship for that reason.
What are the security risks, if any, to the user of running Freenet?
Of running the Freenet software itself?
Yeah.
I don't think significantly different to running any other piece of software that's been written by a third party. So I'd say fairly minimal. With Liquidus is written in Rust, which is a pretty modern programming language that's designed in such a way that a lot of the common security holes that occur in software are difficult or impossible in Rust. So I don't think obviously anytime you install some software on your computer that's been written by a third party, you kind of need to trust that the third party, you need a degree of trust in the third party. If that software is open source, then that makes it easier because at least people can audit the source code. And of course, Liquidus and Freenet are open source. But there's no way to eliminate that risk 100%. But it's certainly no worse than any other piece of software you might install. And in many ways, it's better.
You've talked about not trying to reinvent the wheel here. Like Liquidus will work inside of a web browser using a lot of standard protocols. How easy would it be for somebody to decide, I want to build an app that works on top of this? Like how much of the decentralization part do they have to worry about versus just programming an app that does what they want?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the fundamental object within Liquidus is called a contract. So Liquidus it's a decentralized key value store. So key value store is just a simple dictionary, I think would be the Python term for it, or hash map would be the Java term for it. But the difference is that the keys in this key value store are code. The keys are WebAssembly code that describe what is a permitted value for this key and under what circumstances can that value be modified. And so these contracts, they loosely map to the concept of a database table. So if you were building a service, more than likely that you'd be keeping your data in a database and you'd have kind of different database tables for that. So with Liquidus, the user interface is all in the web browser. So to build the user interface, you can use Vue.js or React or really any JavaScript web framework, of which there are a growing number every day. The part that's different is the back end. So the back end with Liquidus, you need to use these contracts, and you can write your own contracts in WebAssembly, so they can be written in Rust or assembly script, which is kind of a JavaScript dialect that compiles to WebAssembly. That probably requires more expertise, but the good news is that you can also build components in Liquidus that can be used by other people. So not everything, it's just like a computer, you've got the operating system, and then you have layers of components on top of that that get increasingly more sophisticated, so that eventually if you want to build an application, you don't have to kind of build it from first principles every time. You can use pre-existing components, and we'll provide a variety of pre-existing components.
So that would make it a lot easier for people to actually create the next, Twitter or Facebook clone or something that could actually run on top of this.
Yes, absolutely. We want to make it so that if you have a little bit of experience using something like, say, React, for example, you can pick up and start building stuff for Liquidus with a very small learning curve.
All right. One more question, and then I take some stuff from the audience. Can you explain how Liquidus is different from Ethereum smart contracts?
Yeah, so I think the key difference between Liquidus and Ethereum or blockchain more generally is that with the blockchain, this isn't 100% true, but with certainly the original Bitcoin design, every transaction in the blockchain had to be broadcast to everyone else. With Liquidus, because we're using this small world network, it has much better scalability characteristics. Like if you have to broadcast every transaction to everyone, there's going to be a limit to the scalability there, and you see the effect of that in terms of the transaction cost with Ethereum and Bitcoin and that type of thing. So Liquidus is the core idea in Liquidus is fundamentally scalable. Small world networks are extremely scalable. They can scale up to billions of nodes without significantly slowing down. With blockchain, they try to get around that with kind of L2 and various other things, but they're all kind of lipstick on a pig because the core design is based on this idea of broadcasting every transaction to everyone.
All right, let's see if we got some interesting audience questions here. Yeah, if anonymity isn't a focus, what would be the use in China and Saudi Arabia, since governments could still find out who did what? I mean, can they?
It's really a question of effort. How much effort? I would say it would provide some protection, not necessarily anonymity, but simply the fact that there's no kind of well-known central server that is easy to kind of block and monitor for the Chinese government. But it's not the case that there can be no anonymity on Liquidus. It's just not kind of baked into the operating system. Rather, it's a component that would run on top of the operating system. So you can still have anonymity if you want it.
What prevents a troll from hijacking the Freenet network by inputting a lot of contribution of junk?
Yeah, so in part, the spam prevention mechanism that I mentioned earlier, there is a type of attack in this type of network that's called a Sybil attack, which is essentially where you create a very large number of fake peers in the network, and then you use the fact that you may now control a significant part of the network in order to do nefarious things. The approach that Liquidus takes to addressing that problem is that peers in Liquidus all watch each other. And if a peer is doing something bad, an example of that might be there's an update to some information that the peer doesn't pass along. But the way that Liquidus addresses that is other peers in the network will immediately see if a peer is not doing that, And peers, just like people, also have reputations. So that would be a negative mark on that peer's reputation, which would make it less likely for other peers to want to talk to it in future.
What are your thoughts on the GCHQ, the United Kingdom's NSA?
Yeah, I mean, I would not consider myself an expert on it. It's, you know, I think whether it's the NSA or GCHQ, I think it just really demonstrates that kind of everything we're doing is monitored. And I think, of course, we've learned with the kind of Snowden revelations a few years back. I mean, we just know that everything is being monitored. If it can be monitored, it probably is being monitored. And so I think all of this kind of reinforces why the way that the internet is currently designed, which makes it very easy to do that kind of monitoring, that's problematic.
How simple is this to use? Like, could you, when Liquidus is done, could a computer illiterate grandparent use it? The way you described it is you're just going to an address in a browser.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you initially need to install the Liquidus software, which will be a very small, very quick to install, kind of maybe comparable to installing a printer driver, which is pretty much automatic with Windows most of the time. So you install a piece of software, and then from then on, you just use your web browser to talk to Liquidus and to access and to interact with apps that are built within Liquidus.
Do you have another card, Peter?
Yeah, I do.
All right, so let me know when it's done, and I'll give you a moment to change cards.
Yeah.
Peter records all video in 24 karat gold. I record in 1080p like a schmuck.
Well, this one is going to keep on going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the card in here when this gets to the point, and then I have to run back over to my place to get another card. I'll take these two cards out, but we'll still be running. This one
Okay,
is
so that-
for another 50 minutes.
Okay, so I guess after at some point you won't be able to do the switching. It'll fine. So can Liquidus run detached from the rest of the internet on a mesh network?
That's a great question. So version 1.0, that's not a goal. But one of the great things about the small world network kind of architecture is that it's extremely flexible. And one of the things that we pioneered with the original Freenet, this was back in 2005, is what at that time we called it darknet mode. Now, since then, darknet has kind of taken on a bit of a negative connotation. It didn't have that connotation when we were using the term. But the idea behind darknet is that instead of your peer just talking to any other peers in the network, you could limit your peer to just talking to people that you know personally. And then we use the small world network idea to allow the network to self-organize into a small world network with the constraint that you don't control, or with the constraint that the network does not control the actual connectivity between peers. And so that approach could be used to run Liquidus as a mesh network, which I'm very excited about, because one of my big concerns, and this is, some might say paranoid, but a situation where we do have maybe major civil unrest, where the internet infrastructure just goes down. And in that case, I think we really have a very serious problem, because without a means of communication, it's going to be very difficult to kind of get our society back on track.
I don't like how you were about 16 years ahead of your time predicting the censorship issue, and now you're predicting that, well, once there's complete civil unrest, it's like,
well,
please be wrong.
I'm not predicting it. It's more a
Please be wrong.
It's more a contingency.
It's good to be prepared.
Yeah, and so in a situation like that, I think it's going to be essential that we have a global communication network that does not rely on this very centralized infrastructure. And so we've been looking at stuff like LoRa radio, which is this kind of short range, relatively kind of 1-2 mile range radio, so that we could run Liquidus. Because I think part of the problem, if the internet does go down, is we're all so dependent on these highly centralized data centers to run all of these services. So even if we could still communicate directly with other internet users, because WhatsApp is down and Google's down and Gmail's down, we're not actually going to be able to do anything. Whereas because Liquidus actually runs on the peers of the people participating in the network, it's a way that you can provide decentralized services that would be able to survive a catastrophic collapse of the infrastructure.
Is this similar to the Invisible Internet project, or like a pseudo Tor Invisible Internet project combination, if the small network world is the goal?
So the IIP, the I2P, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I2P, it actually grew out of, I think the creator of I2P was involved in Freenet before they built I2P. But I think, in my mind, I2P is quite similar to Tor in that they're onion routing networks. So I'm not sure, I haven't looked that closely at I2P in recent years, so it's possible that they've moved more in the direction of mesh networking, but so far as I'm aware, I don't think that's the goal of that project.
Let's see. Do we have any other interesting questions before we call it a day? Ah, the salty one. Okay, I forgot. Why would governments not just ban it and jail the creator? This is the million and first use cryptography to build a decentralized utopia project. The previous million didn't topple any entrenched power structure and never posed anything resembling a real risk of doing so. Why should the next one be a threat? Or the next 100 million of them? And the salty part in parentheses. And no, this one also won't succeed because technology is not the thing that causes people to join centralized social networks, and technology will not get them to leave either. The repeated belief that it's just a matter of the right technology coming along or being put together tends to show that the people behind these efforts don't actually understand the problem they're trying to solve.
Well, I
was sorting the Reddit thread by Salty.
Yeah. Well, I would disagree with that analysis. I think really it is fundamentally a technology problem. It's an architectural problem. The original architectural mistake was going with a client-server architecture. And the reason we went with the client-server architecture is that's how the World Wide Web worked, and the World Wide Web ended up being the killer app of the internet for the most part. So I think it is fundamentally an architectural problem. And as evidence of that, you can just look at the number of attempts at building decentralized networks over the years. Freenet was the first, and and it works. People use it. It's kind of been ongoing development ever since. It was kind of has been kind of clunky, which is one of the problems we're addressing. But yeah, I think it's fundamentally this idea of how do you build decentralized services. It has not been a solved problem. And the reason why, I didn't, with Liquidus is maybe my fifth attempt at kind of building a successor to Freenet. And it was really when I kind of hit on the specific design of Liquidus that I realized, this is actually the right approach. And I just don't think that's existed before. So yeah, I would disagree that it's a technology problem. It is a technology problem. The problem is that the path of least resistance is centralized, and that's why everything is centralized. But my hope is that now the path of least resistance, or at least similar resistance, will be building decentralized services.
How far along is this? If somebody wanted to get this to beta tested? Yeah.
So we're currently in development. The next kind of big milestone is where we'll release an SDK, which will allow people to start experimenting with software on top of Liquidus, and they'll be able to test it locally. And then the next kind of milestone after that will be taking those local decentralized apps and running them over the peer-to-peer network. And so we hope to have a prototype release really in the next 2 to 3 months. That's the kind of timeline. We've been working on this for about 2 years in earnest.
Now, we here at FUTO have given you a legendary grant to continue moving forward with this project. If other people would like to give a grant in order for you to continue this development of this, where can they find you?
That would be great. So you can go to freenet, all one word, .org, and there's information there both about Liquidus and about the Freenet Classic. And you're welcome to, I can be reached at ian@freenet.org, which is kind of easy to guess. And so if you're interested, if you want to make a kind of small donation, you can do so via the Freenet website. You can do it in using a credit card, Bitcoin, Monero, whatever you want. If you're in a position to provide a larger grant, then definitely send me an email and we'll talk. Ian, IAN, @freenet.org.
Right, and for the viewers out there, there is an application process in the description below for anybody else who is interested in this grant process. We are looking to give grants out to people, projects, and organizations that have been focused on tech freedom and giving sovereignty of your devices, your software, your hardware, and your platforms back to the end user where it belongs. These are grants with no strings attached of anywhere from 5, 6, and sometimes 7 figures to people who've been doing excellent work in this field. We want to hear from more of you. Do email down below, and there is a little list of questions. You just answer those. And that's it for today. And as always, I hope you learned something. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. All right.